Welcome, everyone. Um, it's good to see so many familiar names, and I'm so pleased that we are able to welcome Susan Bernofsky on this afternoon, a day when the weather, at least in the East Coast, makes one almost grateful for Zoom. Before I introduce Susan, I do want to thank the several sponsors of this event, the Yale Translation Initiative in particular, led by my colleagues Alice Kaplan and Harold Augenbraum at the Whitney Humanities Center, which has been so consistently helpful in supporting and organizing translation-related events for the past several years. And I also want to thank the Departments of German and Comparative Literature. So every spring for the past several years, my colleague and collaborator and sometime co-teacher Peter Cole and I have invited to Yale translators whom we especially admire, both for their, so to speak, practical work as translators, but also for the quality of their thinking about translation as an art, as an approach to the history of literature, as an ethical practice, and even as a series of life choices. I'm thinking of Richard Seaberth's talk several years ago, which was titled A Life in Translation. And other guests have included Lydia Davis and the entirely unrelated Dick Davis, who was a wonderful poet from the Persian. Last year, we hosted Michael Sells, the translator of the mystical poet Ibn Arabi, and earlier this spring, we had the pleasure of listening to Richard Zenith talk about his second thoughts as a serial, not to say inveterate, translator and biographer of the Portuguese poet Pessoa. So in some ways, I'm surprised that it's taken as long as it has to have Susan at Yale, given Peter and my shared and longstanding admiration for Susan's work. And I wonder if, in part, we were simply intimidated by her evident busyness, by the sheer quantity as well as quality of things she's apparently able to do all at once. Susan is an associate professor at the MFA program at Columbia, where she's also the director of the program in literary translation. She's the recipient of fellowships from the American Academy in Berlin, the Cullman Center at the Public Library in New York, and the Guggenheim Foundation. She's the translator of more than 20 books from the German, including but not limited to works by Jenny Erpenbeck and Yoko Tawada and Robert Walser, a biography of whom she, of course, recently published with Yale University Press as a Clairvoyant of the Small, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award this past year. For me, it's impossible, it's frankly unappealing to choose a favorite from among those books. So I'll simply say that on my nightstand right now is her translation of Walser's Microscripts. These are the stories and reflections, meditations that Walser wrote on the back of business cards and calendar squares in this incredibly shrunken form of handwriting. And it's a really beautiful and beguiling book, and it often keeps me up at night. Susan has also been, I think it's fair to say, among the best, the most intelligent, as well as tenacious ambassadors for translation to the larger literary world. And she's argued in essays and forewords and afterwords and edited books for the importance of translation to our intellectual culture, both historically and in the present, while also making a case for the necessity of taking the act of translation seriously, not as a derivative or a mechanical skill, but as a formative act in its own right. And as she puts it in an essay that she co-authored with Esther Allen, an essay that I've often used in the classroom, quote, "To perceive the translator as endowed with agency, intent, skill, and creativity is to destabilize the foundations of the way we read, forcing us to take in a text and a literary performance of that text, to see two figures where our training as readers, our literary upbringing has trained us to see only the author." My own first encounter with Susan's ambassadorial or advocacy work was through her supremely helpful blog, Translationista, which for 10 years served as a very important node for information and opinion and news about the world of translators and translations. And Susan seemed to know all of the important conferences and publications and funding opportunities in that world, and also dispensed an awful lot of free practical advice about how to secure rights for translation, how to review ethically a work in translation, and which magazines you should submit to. So it was one of those blogs that really imagined and then helped bring into being a community. It was proof, in the words of Kenneth Rexroth, which many in the audience will recognize, that in doing translation, you meet such a nice class of people. And it was from Susan's blog, in fact, that I learned about the Penheim Translation Fund grants. And I know that there are many aspiring translators or translators in bloom in the audience. And my free advice is for you to look up that grant if you haven't already, which I applied for while I was in grad school and received, and which led to the publication of my own first translation. That was very important for me, and may have even led to some life choices I'm still working through. And I mention this not only by way of an absurdly belated expression of thanks to Susan, but also because getting started in translation is the subject of her talk today, which is called Translating Your First Magic Mountain. If you have questions after her talk or during her talk, if they occur to you, please, rather than putting them in the chat, please put them in the Q&A, which is also down at the bottom of your screen. And I will moderate that discussion after her lecture. So please join me in welcoming Susan to Yale.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Robin, for these kind words of introduction. Thank you to Peter Cole for inviting me, along with Robin, to speak, and to the Yale Translation Initiative and the Departments of German and Comparative Literature. I'm very grateful to be here. And thank you to all of you for showing up this afternoon to spend some time talking translation with me. So today I've been asked to speak not just about my own work, as I usually do, but about yours. That is, the projects you're thinking about starting, the ones you've just started, the ones you're already a bit of the way into, but you're not sure you're on the right track. If there's anyone in this room Zoom room, who's in the habit of diving right into a new book translation project with no doubts or worries, please tell me how you do it, because I'd love to know. For me, as for pretty much all the professional translators I know, starting a new book, though incredibly exciting, is generally a time of mild, if not severe, disorientation, because you're having to think about how to put language to a whole new literary universe. Next slide, please. When I first began my current project, a retranslation of Thomas Mann's canonical monolith, The Magic Mountain, I spent several days just drafting different versions of the first lines of the prologue and pinned them to the wall beside my desk so I could walk around doing other things and come back to them, editing pencil in hand. Every time I made a change, I printed out a new clean version so that I could imagine this new version as set in stone and see what it felt like. It was like I was building a staircase, needing to get the first step right so it could bear my weight en route to the next one. Here's what the first sentence sounds like in my translation in progress. Next slide, please. The story of Hans Castorp that we mean to tell, not for his sake, for the reader will find him to be a simple though agreeable young man, but for the sake of the story, which strikes us as eminently worth relating, while it must also be emphasized, as we do wish to do Hans Castorp justice, that the story is his and that not every story can happen to just anyone. This is a story that took place a very long time ago. It is encrusted, so to speak, with historical verdigris, and clearly it must be presented in the verb tense connoting the most distant past. This sentence has now gone through many versions. In fact, I revised it again just last week while writing this lecture. The fact that it required so much careful attention is that writing it, finding a way to write a sentence in English that unpacked and replicated what I took to be the sentence's rhetorical strategy in German, was crucial for beginning work on the book as a whole. I cannot emphasize enough, and this is crucial, I believe, for beginning any translation project, which is why I'm speaking about it today, how necessary it is for the translator to form an opinion regarding the rhetorical strategies the writer is using in the work they are setting out to translate. In the case of this particular sentence, you will immediately note the convoluted structure. Next slide, please. Here, I'll show it to you in German, so you can see that all these parentheses aren't just a whim on my part. Here we have a narrator who is introducing his story by trying to say several things at once, with the result that this sentence has one big bracket in it, everything between the M dash and the colon. And that big bracket has two smaller brackets inside, represented by parentheses. If you take all the brackets and their contents away, the narrator's first sentence pretty much just says that the story he's about to tell us, and I definitely think of this narrator as male, by the way, is a very old one. This is an old story, so it should be told entirely in the pluperfect. And then this thought has two levels of aside embedded in it. The top level aside has to do with why the story is being told, and the two lower level insertions speak of the story's main character. First, noting that he is a simple sort of fellow, and then implying that he's special nonetheless, since this story that features him is so eminently worthy of being told. So this narrator's opening gambit is an apologia, and a wordy one at that, one that doubles back on itself to double down on its defense of the story you're about to read. That's a lot of self-justification for a single sentence. It's also a lot of compression, especially for a book that's all about expansion, specifically the all but infinite expansion of time. Which brings me to what is perhaps my principal regret in the translation of this opening passage, the necessity, i.e. I decided it was necessary, of translating the word Zeitform, literally time form, as verb tense, which is what the word means in this context. But really, this book is all about forms of time. So I entered this translation by thinking about the style and structure of the narrator's entry into the story in German, which is a way of connecting a big idea, what is this book about, with a smaller one, how is the sentence constructed? The part is always part of a whole and vice versa, but before we spiral too deeply into the depths of the hermeneutic circle, I want to talk about a few other points of entry I had into this translation. In a talk I gave back when I was just starting the Magic Mountain, it's called Translation as Storytelling, you can find it on YouTube. I spoke about other ways I found myself organizing my thinking about this at the time brand new project. I initially got quite interested in the idea of the fairy tale as a leitmotif in this book. There are a number of fairy tale references embedded in the text, and in fact, chapter 1 of the book, what you just saw is the prologue, chapter 1 of the book begins with a spin on a standard fairy tale opening. Next slide, please. A simple young man was traveling at the height of summer from Hamburg, the city of his birth, to Davosplatz in the Swiss canton of Graubünden, where he would be visiting for 3 weeks. I'm sure you've already noted the repeated phrase, a simple young man, that Mann also used in the first line of the book's prologue. Next slide, please. This phrase, a simple young man, is key for me because it's a strong initial signal of the fairy tale theme. After all, how many fairy tales do you know that begin with a simple young man setting out to make his fortune in one way or another? Particularly in the German fairy tale tradition, with all the young journeyman stories, a journeyman being a traveling apprentice. It's a familiar motif. And to emphasize this motif, I'm, at least for now, using the word man, even though Mann has Mensch, because man seems to be more familiar as a location in fairy tale contexts in English, and I want to mark this. Next slide, please. And of course, the word simple fits in with that reading as well. You may have some opinions about my choice of simple for einfach, and I'll be happy to go into discussing that in more detail in the Q&A if you like. The short version of my explanation for the choice is one, I am very much inspired by Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, and in particular, her choice of the phrase, a complicated man, for the opening gambit, simple and complicated being etymologically linked. Reason two, after much contemplation and study of the history of the word einfach, I decided that it isn't tragic if something of the secondary connotation, simple-minded, rubs off on our protagonist here. And the primary definition of both einfach and simple is guileless, without guile. And that sense of the word simple is right on the money. Anyhow, the novel's first translator, Helen Lowe Porter, agrees with me about the simple-minded reading being not unacceptable. Back in 1927, she actually translated the word einfach directly as simple-minded in the prologue. And she translated the word as unassuming in the first line of chapter 1. That's an inconsistency that might have been introduced in the editing stage for all I know. Things like that do happen in editing. John E. Woods translates the word as ordinary both times. These are both great translators. I have two amazing forerunners in translating this book, which is inspiring as well as daunting. Anyhow, this all goes to show you how the translator's overarching ideas about what's important in and about a book will inevitably affect even relatively small and local translation decisions. But the part is the whole, and the whole is the parts, as previously established. By the way, as long as you're still looking at the first sentence of chapter 1, let me point out a few other things about it. First off, you'll notice that the English sentence is actually somewhat longer than the German, which is unusual. English translations of German texts tend to shrink by around 15% in my experience because German words are longer. But in this case, Thomas Mann, he of the famously long sentences, opens his story with something quite scaled back. Another nod, in my opinion, to the mode of telling stories familiar from fairy tales. Various elements of the sentence forced me to unpack and expand. Im Hochsommer, literally in high summer, has become at the height of summer. In fact, in many of my earlier drafts, I began the sentence with that phrase because that was the easiest way to get that apparently extra bit of information out of the way. As translators from German soon learn, you will inevitably have to deal with more clauses than sit comfortably in English. So you're always looking for a rug to sweep one or two of them under. But starting the sentence with that phrase made the thing sound more literary, less fairy tale-y. So back to the middle of the sentence it went. Another noun that required unpacking is the Vaterstadt, or paternal city, which in my English becomes the city of his birth. A wordier locution than I'd prefer, but I think I still like it better tonally than native city or hometown, the other two most logical choices. Another difficult decision was the translation of the verb reisen, currently represented by was traveling. In earlier drafts, I played with journeyed or set off on a journey. The hardest part of the sentence, though, is the last bit, because it's important that the 3 weeks be presented as an intention, not as a statement of achieved fact, since Hans Castorp winds up spending over 1,000 pages in Davos. certainly much longer than 3 weeks. In German, the narrator is not lying about this, and I took care to follow his lead. My inspiration here was the theme song to the TV show Gilligan's Island, the first season of which showed in the 1960s, and the second season when I came aboard in the 1970s. That earworm by Sherwood Schwartz and George Weil that some of you are humming to yourselves now contains the immortal lines, 5 passengers set sail that day for a 3-hour tour, a 3-hour tour. That 4 shows intention, not result. The German locution fuhr auf Besuch, traveled with intention to pay a visit, provides a smokescreen for the für of für 3 Wochen. So I needed my own grammatical sleight of hand. The phrase where he will be visiting for 3 weeks would not work at all in the present tense. That would be far more of a commitment than the narrator is willing to make here. But the would be visiting structure, a future intention expressed in a past tense context, feels less definite in my view, thanks to the overlap with the homonym would in its conditional sense, leaving more room for typhoons and tuberculosis to intervene in the speaker's plans. All of this turns out to be anything but simple. Here are some of the many drafts of the opening that survive on my computer. Next slide, please. This is about half of the versions I went through. I decided not to make you look at every last tweak and hesitation. This slide shows 13 versions, but they're too tiny to see. So I also split them up on 2 separate slides so you can have a slightly better look. New slide, please. So I'm not going to read all of them. It's just showing you them to give you a bit of a notion of the sorts of things that one could go through even in a single sentence. Here's 7. Next slide, please. And near the end, we're getting to where I have landed now. So in the Q&A, if you like, we can go back to this slide and we can talk over some of the hair tearing that I went through to arrive at this part of the journey. All right, so a lot of versions in short, and I'm revising along various different axes at once, thinking mainly about vocabulary choices, but also sentence rhythm. Whenever I find myself losing heart, I recall the immortal words of Jack Kerouac, "You can't fall off a mountain," which cheer me, even though I'm pretty sure he's wrong. Slide, please. Here's the mountain from the Dharma Bums, published in 1958. That pointy peak right in the middle is Matterhorn Peak in the Sierras. Any resemblance to the Alps is purely coincidental. Okay. I've been speaking so far of my translation in progress of The Magic Mountain, which is importantly for this conversation, a retranslation. In the case of a retranslation, it is particularly crucial for the translation to display a point of view, since otherwise its very raison d'etre is in question. I mean, this is an important novel that already exists in English in 2 outstanding translations. So why would I spend years of my life retranslating it if I didn't feel I had a story to tell about its contents that didn't quite come clear in the way I envision it in the previous versions? The main impetus, though, behind this particular retranslation was commercial. The editorial leadership at my publisher, Norton, felt that there was room in the marketplace for a new translation of this classic novel, and they wanted to be there to take advantage of this opportunity. They suggested the project to me and not vice versa, though I was certainly intrigued and excited to try my hand at this powerful and exceptionally influential book. Especially after my years of working on the prose of Robert Walser. I've translated 7 books by him and wrote his biography, which came out last year, as noted, noting that Robert Walser is pretty much the diametrical opposite of Mann, temperamentally speaking. In any case, for a retranslation, it's crucial to have a point of view, a sense of what you hope to achieve in your translation. For this reason, I don't look at the other translations while I'm working. In fact, I look at them almost never. For the purposes of thinking about the word simple, I looked up the other translators' choices, but I don't even remember what they did with the rest of those sentences because I don't want to look at them too hard. I don't want to get distracted from my own sense of the book, which is delicately gelling in my head in real time. I might check in with them just enough to make sure I'm not inadvertently replicating their work at key junctures, but that's just it. Now, let's turn to first translations. In other words, translation projects in which you will be the first person to create an English language version of a given text. I recently attended a talk by Matthew Salis's, author of the truly excellent book, Craft in the Real World, which explores how and why to center the writer in the creative writing workshop. And he said something that really stuck with me. The goal of the workshop is to excite the writer about revisions. I think we don't talk about excitement enough when we think about writing. We do talk a lot about inspiration, which is a metaphor of something arriving from the outside, blow or breathe into from Latin. Whereas to be excited is to feel called on to do something. So the impetus may arrive from the outside, but the power to do the thing is already within you. The ideal state in which to approach a translation is one in which the work literally excites you. In other words, it is calling to something that is already inside you. In other words, translate what speaks to you, translate out of love. There's nothing new about the claim that translation is the closest form of reading. That claim gets thrown around like a cliche, but it is also true. Now, I'd like to ask you to put a second idea next to that one and think about them together. The second idea is that everything I've been saying about having to find your own personal approach to a canonical work you're doing a retranslation of is actually true for first translations as well. I'll say it again differently. Even if you are the first person ever to translate a work, and even if you have no expectation that anyone might ever translate that work again, you should be thinking about how to shape your own personal approach to it, one that makes sense for you and your understanding of the work and its context. When Helen Lowe Porter published her translation of Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain, in 1927, 3 years after it first appeared in German, it wasn't at all clear that this novel was going to become a classic work worthy of multiple translations. While the book definitely enjoyed popular success in the German-speaking world, it went into its 100th printing in 1928. Its reception was mixed, with many deeming it a lesser work by the author of the great Buddenbrooks, which had come out 23 years earlier when the author was only 26. These intervening decades were exceedingly painful to Thomas Mann, who felt a great deal of pressure to produce a new work that might be deemed of similar significance to his debut. So The Magic Mountain's critical reception was disappointing despite its commercial success. In fact, when Thomas Mann received the Nobel Prize in 1927, the citation specifically lauds him as the author of Buddenbrooks. That must have stung. So Helen Tracy Lowe Porter of Oxford, England, could not have guessed that her translation of this novel would be one of a series, but she certainly did place her mark on it. She was an exceptionally brilliant, skillful translator with a superb ear and mastery of English style, and she translates The Magic Mountain as exactly as if it were a novel by the author of Buddenbrooks. In other words, a work of the long 19th century. And she isn't wrong about that, or not entirely. But from my perspective, which offers the comfortable overview available when one is looking back on a literary period from a century in the future, The Magic Mountain's modernism sets it apart from the book that initially made Mann's career, even though it is his later work, The Magic Mountain, the Joseph novels, Dr. Faustus, on which his lasting reputation is based. So what is it that calls out to you from the book you are contemplating translating? You should know what it is, be able to articulate it, and think consciously about what it will take to get across those aspects of the work that most excite you in English. As I am always telling my students, things tend to grow blurry in translation as a word's chain of associations in a given language are broken, perhaps because the word that best corresponds to it for your purposes has associations of its own in English, associations that perhaps differ markedly from those in the original context. Sometimes these differences are specific and local. I had a little set of translation problems in Jenny Erpenbeck's novel, The End of Days, that arose because she used the German Yiddish word Schlamassel as part of a leitmotif. But the English Yiddish word Schlamassel means something different. Because of this, I had to lose the Yiddish word in that particular leitmotif, though Yiddish still plays a role at other points in the book, so the general motif of Yiddishkeit is not lost. This is an example of a specific local problem that might be part of a larger thread. What I'm asking you to think about here is the set of threads running through a book, thematic and stylistic. And once you've identified them for yourself, think about what you can do rhetorically to make them visible in your translation, a sort of reading made manifest that identifies the translation of yours, the translation as yours by foregrounding your vision of the work. In Erpenbeck's The End of Days, for example, could I have the next slide, please? This being one of my favorite of her books, along with Visitation, the idea that guided me in my work on the translation is that Erpenbeck views history as personal, or more specifically, that she's very conscious of the way that human history, viewed on a global scale, lies in a continuum of actions, such that every decision you make in your everyday life has the potential to set off an avalanche, of secondary implications that might result, for example, in a person's file being placed on a particular stack of files that will lead to their deportation, or alternatively, to their miraculously being spared deportation. So many forking paths, so many possibilities. In Erpenbeck's work, as I read it, this sense of the endless contingency of destiny is coupled with a rhetorical strategy that's highly dependent on the hospitality of the German language to what in English is generally denigrated as the comma splice. Sentence after sentence strung together in an endless flow, sometimes connected with an and or und, sometimes not, but creating the feeling that every thought or action is connected to others in a potentially infinite string. Next slide, please. Here's a sentence, for example, describing a woman who's climbed up on the roof of her house in an attempt to escape a pogrom in a small town in Poland. Her husband has just been brutally murdered a few sentences earlier by a group of their neighbors, a horrific scene. Losing consciousness, she tumbles, rolls down off the sloping roof, and falls, as luck would have it, on the heap of clothes, linens, and curtains thrown out onto the street by the men, and she remains lying there in the heap of rags amid blood consisting of the raspberry jam she herself made the summer before. The jar shattered when it was thrown, and now she lies there, her limbs broken, her eyes closed, and none of the people standing there silently in the square comes closer or checks to see if she's still alive. Even though this sentence contains some retrospective information, her making the jam the summer before, the fact that the people sacking her house have thrown possessions out the window, there's a strong sense of a forward thrust here. And I took great pains with much revision, very many drafts to make it seem that way, because the sense that the inexorable forward march of history is exemplified in sentences like these is, for me, the most crucial identifying feature of Erpenbeck's prose as I understand it. Next slide, please. But this gets us back to the problem of which came first, the parts or the whole. It isn't really possible to have a sense of how the parts of a book are working until you've gotten a feel for its overarching concerns. And I believe that even having read a book before beginning to translate it can't get you as fully inside its rhetorical structures as you'll need to be to do your work. Therefore, it is necessary to begin without being prepared to begin. In fact, how precisely you choose to begin may be finally immaterial. What is material is understanding that your first approach to a book you intend to translate is unlikely to be your last. You must begin paying as much attention as possible to the rhetorical strategies the author is using on the sentence level, the paragraph level, the page level. And then as you develop a greater knowledge about how all of this is working, you must start again from the beginning. Possibly you'll be able to revise what you first wrote in your translation, but often this doesn't work. Revising translations can be as fraught a process as revising a work of your own poetry or fiction. And often the words you first put on the page can become a trap for the imagination. All too often I see students attempting to revise their work by just plugging in different words and phrases into the structures they initially chose for the sentences of their translation, not fully grasping that every new word introduced into a framework has the potential to alter the entire living environment of a sentence by changing a cadence, which changes the rhetorical emphasis, which changes pretty much everything about the sentence and therefore also changes the work. So I would encourage you to get excited about revising, to return to Matthew Salis's notion, and to revise outside the box, being open to all the ways you can possibly help the text sound like itself in English, in your English, written with love, care, and excitement. So that's what I have to say for now, and I look forward to discussing all of this with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was really terrific. It was rich, it was detailed, it was in the weeds and then back out of the weeds. And I'm sure that lots of the students here, as well as me and others, learned from it as well and took notes and took your good advice. So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, and maybe I'll pose one. You suggested that you'd be happy to talk about some word choices in that initial sentence, and one of the questions has to do asked you to do exactly that. So here's the question: would honest be a suitable translation of Einfacher because of the Yiddish connotation of Mensch, as in he's a real Mensch?
Honest is not wrong for Einfach, but it's a bit of a stretch. I would not, however, go via the Yiddish in this particular case, just because as common as Mensch is as a word in Yiddish, and of course, we use the word Mensch colloquially to mean like, a good person, a warm and honest and caring person. But the word Mensch is just also in German the most common word for human being. It is the way you say human being in German. And so the Yiddish Menschness is not primary as within the range of meaning within German, and certainly within Thomas Mann's German. Now, a writer writing in Yiddish would be a different matter. A Jewish writer writing in German, but thematizing sort of Jewishness, that might be another matter too. But in this case, I think it would be, putting things into it. Thomas Mann has so much cultural anxiety in him, specifically via, his mother's Brazilianness. And that's, Veronica Fischner is writing a book about this right now that I'm very much looking forward to reading. But I I think it's too Jewish for the Magic Mountain. That was a long path around to that. Too Jewish, says the Jew.
One of my favorite jokes translation jokes, which is not mine, but which I've heard from others that I like retelling, is the story, almost certainly apocryphal, of Richard Howard being asked on one of these occasions, how would you translate the word X? And then it's some incredibly recherché word from the French. And he said, well, I don't translate words.
Yeah, I miss him.
It seems suitable to bring him into the conversation.
Yeah, of recently blessed memory, beloved colleague.
While we're kind of thinking about the small things before maybe going out to the big things, here's another kind of technical question about the Magic Mountain, which asks, the Magic Mountain has many phrases in French, long passages, in fact, in French. Yeah. Are you translating the French in the Magic Mountain? Do you know if recent translators into other languages leave the French in French? How do you think about that problem?
It depends on what language you're translating into, because the question is, like for Thomas Mann, it went without saying that the majority of his readers would probably be able to read the French, highly educated German speakers probably also could read French. And the French of this book is not super fancy French. It's, it's the kind of French, it's not Flaubert's French, it's Thomas Mann's French. And so he could count, I think, on most of his readers being able to speak French. And if not, he was going to be, let slight snobbishness carry the day and say, fine. I don't think that I have the same ability to make that assumption right now. I have not yet reached the parts of the book. I'm in the middle of chapter 5 right now in my translation. I haven't yet reached the point of entire chapters in French, but for now I'm planning to translate them, but probably put the English in an appendix so that the translator, the reader who doesn't read French, can just substitute from the appendix at that point. But phrases in French that show up, I am keeping, because they're showing something of the multilingual texture of the conversation that happens in Davos. And so that's different.
If I might, here's a kind of practical question from me, which I think is one that students, especially now that they're at the end of the semester and they're working on their final projects, might be thinking about, wondering about, because you have such a wonderful way of describing the back and forth between the first sentence and the larger project. And of course, once you get forward, then you look back on that first sentence and maybe you revise it again, but it allows you to keep going on to the next chapter. And then when you've done that chapter, you look back at the first sentence again, and because the voice keeps developing in one's head. It keeps getting more complicated, but maybe also a little bit more precise as you go on with it. So what do you say about when that process has kind of come to full development? Is there a feeling that you get? Are there any stories you can tell about when the translation process, which is of course unending in some sense, but has for you at least come to an end?
Yeah, I'm kind of the school that it's done when my publisher has torn the page proofs out of my hand, my hands bleeding from trying to grab onto them and make one last change. But it is very satisfying now to revise earlier parts of the book as I translate later ones, because the work on the book has caused things to fall into some degree of increased clarity, which is very gratifying, because it's a very difficult book, and it's an uphill struggle. I found, interestingly, that the main thrust of the changes that I do make when I go back is to make things simpler. In my first my first stab at things, I fancied up the prose a bit. And a lot of the translation is finding out ways to pare it back. And in a sense, I think that is part of the book's approach to modernism, because, you think about the foreword, the preface that Lydia Davis wrote to her translation of Proust to, The Way by Swans or Swan's Way, whichever, edition you have. She talks about the book being ornate in terms of its syntax, but not of its word choices. And I see Thomas Mann as sort of being an interesting counterpart to that. I'm adding more clarity, which means, fancy vocabulary maybe gets chopped and simpler vocabulary put a little more foregrounded. He's definitely playing with very simple sentences juxtaposed with syntactically more complicated ones in different parts of the book. So he's clearly thinking about a voice that will be distinct from his Buddenbrooks voice, which is a little more ornate overall, I think. So yeah, clarity, which often means just raking out the too much underbrush.
Yeah. While thinking about that long uphill climb, I'm taking a question from Sophie. Hello, Sophie, out there. Wonderful to have you here. She has two questions, but I'm actually going to skip to the second one because I think the first one is you've answered it in some ways. But the second one is, thank you so much for this fantastic talk. Susan, do you have a strategy for attending to detailed revisions and maintaining energy on a work as long and as monumental as The Magic Mountain?
Yeah. That's a really great question. And that question is extremely relevant to my life right now, because I'm in the middle of this 20-page chunk of chapter 5, where the protagonist is doing nothing but sitting on his balcony reading physiology textbooks. And, for Thomas Mann, this was, a matter of cutting and pasting and mashup. There's been an army of researchers. We know which lines come from which source. The sources have all been beautifully traced, which doesn't help the translator that much. It would if there were beautiful English translations of the original sources, period translations that I could in turn cut and paste and mash up from and just have a ball with it. But they're not. He's quoting from 1910 and 1920 editions of texts that were republished over 40 years and literally dozens of editions. And the only English translations that were ever done are from editions from the 1870s and 80s. So 30, 40 years earlier, when the science was completely different. So I have those those English translations, and I'm reading around in them to grab some science terms from them to use in my translation. And it's just very sloggy. But then I'm remembering that to Thomas Mann, this book is inherently a comedy. I mean, a philosophical comedy, a very bleak comedy in which a lot of people get sick and suffer and die. But he envisioned this as his light, farcical book to accompany Death in Venice, and he had a lot of fun with it. And in his science talk, he sure does lean very heavily on the parts about reproduction. So there's lots about spermatozoa swimming around and meeting the egg cells and how they get together and all that stuff on a cellular level. And
it is kind of funny.
It is kind of funny. So I'm remembering the humor and remembering that he was having fun. And so I'm handling the science now from the point of view of the science is supposed to be a signifier of scientific, but also be funny. And so I'm chucking it up a little. So I could actually read you a sentence. Would you like to hear one sentence from that?
Please, that would be great.
All right, here's one sentence. If I can find it, it's here somewhere. Here we go. With a volume of embryology propped against his midriff, the young adventurer followed the development of the organism from the moment when the spermatozoon, one of many and the first of these, propelling itself with a whip-like movement of its nether parts, poked the tip of its head through the gelatinous covering of the ovum and drilled its way into the knob of reproductive material that the protoplasm of the cellular cortex caused to bulge forward to receive it. So I'm trying to be
prose.
I'm trying to be funny to give life to it, because, you know, otherwise it's, you know, it's not supposed to be dull, or, you know, but it's anyway, it's ye olde science.
I have a question from, I have to say, I'm remembering reading The Magic Mountain the first time in English translation. It made me laugh out loud more times than I can remember. It is really funny. So that's a great piece of advice, maybe. In this case, at least, to keep remembering that it's supposed to be comic.
Yeah, but how to not lose heart in the middle of a translation? That's like maybe the most important question. Chocolate, lots of chocolate.
My colleague Katie Trumpener.
Oh, hi, Katie.
Thanks you, and says, to what extent, she has a longer, I'll read it. There's a number of questions within this question. So, to what extent do you find yourself thinking of other Mann works? How does Mann generally use the word X or Y in his other novels? And then would it be helpful, moreover, especially if you were to be translating Buddenbrooks rather than Magic Mountain, to also cross-read Heinrich Mann for a kind of twins separated at birth effect, two very different writers raised in the same household and milieu? I'm asking the first question partly because I'm working on a scholarly edition along with other scholars working on parallel volumes, and that's very helpful to compare notes with them. Yeah.
Yes. You know, in fact, when Yale first said, "Can we do a new Magic Mountain?" I immediately said, "Can we do a new Buddenbrooks?" Just because, you know, I love that book so much. But thinking about how he, you know, it's a point, you know, should I have a concordance here and looking up all the other points? But the thing is, these nuances of this word appeared here, and there, and the other time probably would not affect my translation decisions. They would affect my overall knowledge of how the passage is to be interpreted. But there are so many options already in English that this would just like open up even more options. I think you would have to be smarter than me to do that. So the answer is,
or have even more time.
The answer is yes, that would be good, but I can't manage it.
Here's another question. The wonderful thing about talking to you, Susan, is that I can go from the technical to the philosophical to the theoretical, and then back to the other one so easily. So here's a kind of political, practical one. It seems to me from Jan, my colleague Jan Higgins, it seems to me that Thomas Mann is not in a productive relation with contemporary Anglo-American culture. Did Norton specify why they think this is a good time to do a new translation of The Magic Mountain? What do you think? How does Thomas Mann speak to us now?
You know,
always an important question.
Yeah, you know, this book has a centenary coming up, and I think that was probably played some role. I also don't think that this, well, all right, here's one thing that this book unfortunately is all too apropos to our current era, and that is, you know, influenza pandemic. Now, this is a book about tuberculosis, but keep in mind that during the writing of this novel, Thomas Mann himself did live through the 1918 influenza pandemic. One of his daughters, Monica, actually developed flu, so he had the experience of having a family member direly ill. And, keep in mind, this was incredibly deadly. Like, coronavirus now I think has killed, 6 million people to date, which is a enormous number. But the 1918 pandemic killed, 50 million, a factor of 10 more, it was unbelievably dire. And so he's writing about tuberculosis. And I think that he ended the novel in the framing when he did, in part, well, how much longer do we really want it to be? But he framed the action chronologically and bracketed out the war, but also bracketed out the pandemic, because to be writing about an influenza pandemic in a book about tuberculosis would have been really complicated and messy. So, but I believe that his experience of influenza influenced the goriness of, and the, just the sense of the brutality of illness as it kills off character after character. Yeah, I think the decision was largely commercial, because this is a book that's taught again and again. And, I love the 1995 translation that John Woods did. I would have no problem teaching it. I would enthusiastically teach it. But I think that since it's a book that's regularly taught, Norton's thinking, okay, every generation we want one. So this is their new generational one. And I think it's as simple as that they're looking at this book as a perennially interesting book and not one that has to speak to our moment at this particular moment.
Yeah. We have, there are a couple of questions on asking you to talk about your translations of Yoko Tawada. One from a student in Peter's class. So would you mind speaking a little bit more about your experience of translating Tawada, given the strong focus on translation and switching in and out of one's mother tongue in her own work?
Yeah. Tawada is just, I can't even begin to tell you how much I adore her work. And in fact, I'm sort of I admit this, I'm sort of slightly cheating on Thomas Mann right now, because in the midst of the pandemic, when, my father was dying and I was worried about my mother, and my sister and I helped her move from Louisiana to Indiana. And while all of this was going on, I just could not bring myself to focus on Thomas Mann. But Yoko Tawada had written a gorgeous pandemic novel, a very short novel called Paul Celan und der chinesische Engel. Paul Celan and the Chinese Angel would be a literal translation of the title. And it's a book set during the pandemic, but doesn't talk about the pandemic. And the plot is that the protagonist is trying to make up his mind whether or not to go from Berlin to Paris for a Paul Celan conference. And he has many, many conversations with the titular Chinese angel, who's in fact a Frenchman of Chinese heritage, who is a great fan of Paul Celan's work. And they have many, many conversations about acupuncture and Paul Celan with the linking thread, the meridian. And this book has so much interlingual play in it. The man is, or the interlocutor is referred to as the trans-Tibetan man, trans-tibetische Mann. And I'm trying to decide how to talk about that. That's a word that comes from Paul Celan's poetry, but it was used possibly in an older generation of linguists to talk about what's now known as Sino-Tibetan languages, earlier maybe trans-Himalayan languages. So between all of this, German and English, French, and that's, we're not even talking about Japanese here. But her earlier book, The Naked Eye, there's words from Vietnamese in that book where, I was consulting with friends who speak Vietnamese on the translations. And so, yeah, like with the Jenny Erpenbeck example, where Yiddish can't translate Yiddish necessarily, it can get so complicated, and it's really fascinating, the sorts of translation problems that Tawada brings. It's like nothing else, really. And if you've looked at her new novel out in English, Scattered All Over the Earth, which just came out a couple months ago, translated by Margaret Mitsutani, which is just phenomenal. That book too, it's all about interlingual play and a woman searching for her lost native language, which isn't spoken anymore because her country doesn't exist anymore. But she has made up a new language called Panska, which is the universal Scandinavian language, which is comprehensible to any Scandinavian, and a speaker of any Scandinavian language. And she's teaching it now to asylum seekers in Scandinavian countries. Okay, I think I've rambled on about this enough, but
no, I really like the idea.
Nothing better than Tawada.
I like the idea of you cheating on Thomas Mann with Yoko Tawada. That sounds like a short story or something.
Yeah, it's just
creative infidelity.
Yeah. So, a year and a half ago, I did a translation of this, 100-page novel, and now I'm doing a quickie revision of it so it can go into print. So New Directions will publish it in about a year, to my great delight.
Something to look forward to. Here's another question from a student, actually, that Peter and I both have, which is Baylina. This is a very good question. Why do you think it's better to approach retranslation as retranslation rather than approaching the process as though you're the first one to translate the work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a sense, I am approaching it as if I were the first person, but before the translation starts, so while I'm working on it, it's as if I were the first one, but before the translation starts, I do think it's important to know why you are doing this translation and to think about what you have to say about the book. Here, I'll give you an example. So I did a new Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse for Modern Library in 2007 or something. And after I did that, Modern Library said, great, do you want to do a Steppenwolf for us now? And I went and looked at the older Steppenwolf translation by Basil Creighton. And I looked at that translation and thought, oh my God, this translation does what I think about this book. And I don't really think I could do something about this book I would like better than this translation that expresses my feelings about Steppenwolf. So I said no thank you to that contract, even though I would have been interested in doing it, but I didn't really feel that I had something to say about that book that translation didn't already say beautifully. I don't know. Today, if I had the same question, would I think about the book again and find I had different things to say? I don't know. But, in the case, of Kafka's Metamorphosis, in the case of Siddhartha, and in the case of Magic Mountain, I do feel like I do have a Magic Mountain in me that hasn't been there before. And I wasn't sure I did about that other book. But once I signed the contract, then I'm translating it as mine. It's only isolated things that I might look up to compare with the other translations, but I'm barely looking at them.
My colleague Jane Tylis, and just let us know if this is a question you can answer or not, because it references a different book. But she wonders if you have any reactions to Karen Briggs's This Little Art.
I love it. I love that book.
If it's relevant to this conversation because of the focus on the Low Porter translation, and then it had that now slightly infamous review in the Times. And anyway, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was one of the co-signers of a letter in response to that review. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of Kate Briggs's book, and I really love the way she manages to talk about translation and her life, and Helen Low Porter's life, and Roland Barthes, and translations she's done, and translations other people have done, and things that are going on politically in her world, and children. It's so many threads woven together, I think very artfully. And, I already loved Helen Low Porter before reading her book, but she reminded me how inspiring a writer Helen Low Porter was. She was truly truly a great writer. And, I think of Kate Briggs and sort of sitting in this cultural space where maybe the other person I would put in that space with her is Kate Zambrino, whose book To Write as If Already Dead, which I recently reread, I think is also talks about different overlapping threads of reading and being with a book and writing about another writer's life in a really productive way. So short answer, I am a big fan.
Well, while thinking about that kind of imbrication of translation and life and biography, and here I have to, I've had this question that nobody, and nobody's been able to answer, and I don't really expect, I certainly don't expect you to either, but there's this weird fact about Arabic, which is the language I work on most often, in which the word for translation, which is tarjama from tarjuman, tarjama also means, in the classical language at least, tarjama also means biography. Translation and biography, which of course is arts that you've practiced severally. And here's a question about that. What kinds of preparation did you do when you wrote the biography of Walser? How did this type of writing demand a different kind of excitement to be maintained throughout the project?
Yeah, that's a great question. Having translated Robert Walser for literally 30 years, when I sat down to start the biography, I had this feeling, oh, well, I know him pretty well. I know his work pretty well because I've been translating it all this time and studying his life, because his work is of a sort that makes you want to know about him. I think a lot of readers have that experience. And when I really got down to it in the biography, I realized that everything that I knew about him was the smoke screens that he had set up around him, and that I really didn't know beans about him. Well, okay, I'm exaggerating. I didn't know as much as I thought I had. So I really had to, it was very humbling to start again. But having translated his work, once you translate something, it's inside you and you remember it in a different way than if you've just read it, I think. And so while I was learning biographical facts about him, certain facts would resonate with lines in the work, and I would think, oh, okay, so that line, even if it's not literally about this, maybe this came from that. And so I did find myself making connections by that. But wow, it really is, a different sort of engagement with a writer's work. I guess you spoke with Richard Zenith. I wonder what I had to miss that talk, but I wonder what he had to say about that. It was really an interesting and humbling process for me to delve into biography after having been.
Well, I wonder if I mean, I don't know, I forget if you're touched on this, but if I think sometimes translators, this is another cliche about translators, is that they know the work, the poem, the novel, whatever it may be, better than anybody else because they've lived with it. They've done a close reading, they've done an interpretation, they've made it sort of part of who they are in some sense, right? They've tried to inhabit a voice. So it's a cliche, but it's another true one, I think. And so I wonder, but the biography, you also have to tell about, who his mother was, who his father was, where he went to school, all that kind of stuff. And whether you felt that tension between really wanting to talk about the writing that you knew so well from having translated it for so long, back to this, what might seem like a relatively, abstract or not quite as exciting, just life.
Yeah, no, and next time I go back to translating him, if I ever get off the mountain, it'll be different because of having studied his life so much. It will be different. I will be looking, I think, with a more skeptical eye towards his claims about reality and his own life reality, which is fine. I might not translate any differently, but I will think about it differently now. Yeah.
I have a philosophical question from Paul North, whom you may know. And he says, if it's not too personal, or too scary? Would you be willing to talk about
This is promising.
Wait for it. I don't think it'll be too scary. Would you be willing to talk about a translator's guilt? I wonder if this is a good category to understand the impulse that drives you back to revise and rewrite. Language guilt, that English wants to be German but can never do it. Translator's guilt, that you bear the weight of the past, of culture.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. And those who don't know German, the word for guilt, Schuld, is also the word for debt. Schuld, very important word in the German language, and psyche. Yeah. Yeah. There's one Jenny Erpenbeck book in which I mistranslated a noun that to this day, I can't help cringing when I think about it. I'm not going to tell you what it is. Maybe somebody will find it. If you read all of Jenny, if you know German, you read the 5 Erpenbeck books I've read against the German, you might find this. And it's so frustrating to me because I had a specific conversation about this noun with her because I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly. And we even talked about it, but it turns out that the language she was using and the language I was using still allowed for enough ambiguity that the noun wound up different. And then later, somehow, I don't even remember how I realized I'd made a mistake. And next time I saw her, we discussed it again, and this time we drew pictures. And from her drawing pictures and my drawing pictures, we understood that we had misunderstood each other. But, I feel guilty about it, and it's going to show up in someone's dissertation someday. That's life. I could correct it for later editions, but, it's out. It's in print, and there it is.
We are coming to the end of the time, but here's a couple of practical questions again. We'll go back to the practical questions. For grants, such as the Penheim translations, which I mentioned in my introduction.
I one of those supported my very first Jenny Erpenbeck translation, some 20 years ago.
They've been just incredibly helpful for so many 20, 25, 30-year-olds who are doing it for the first time. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's very gratifying.
Yeah, it's also important that, it means your project comes to the attention of potential publishers and editors. It shows up on lists on the PEN America website and emails. I would encourage everyone to apply for one of those if you're an emerging translator.
And so the question is, well, there are two. How finished should a submission be? I ask in light of the vast number of possibilities that come out of the translation process that you've shown us today. And then 2, this is an entirely separate question, but do you have any recommendations for word processors or other software specifically for literary translation? This is a kind of Paris Review magazine question. What sort of pencil do you use? What tea do you drink while you're translating? Any word processor recommendations?
Yeah, I just use Word, and I thought about it. I actually bought Scrivener when I was writing the biography and wound up not using it because I don't know. I'm a bit too Luddite to be the best person to answer that question, but with the Magic Mountain, there are so many words that you have to keep track of how many times they previously occurred. And so I keep a running index of important words so I can see how I translate them each time they show up. And I'm doing this manually, and probably there's computer programs that could do that better, but ask somebody else, I don't know. And how polished your translation should be. It doesn't have to be like a finished project, but you're applying for a grant that 150 other people to 200 people are also applying for, and they can give like 10. So if it's not polished, it probably will not rise to near enough to the top of the heap to be a contender. So it does have to be pretty polished, but it's, you're submitting 15 pages. So it's not like you have to translate the entire book and polish the entire book. It's a sample. So I would say put your best foot forward with that sample, because you're showing not just that the book is an interesting project in its own right, but that you are an interesting person to translate it. So you're showcasing your own skills as a translator as well as the work's, greatness. So polish away and then submit. That's my advice.
This will be the last question, and we're coming full circle, like the worm Ouroboros, back to the Einfach. So somebody suggests, and I think they're thinking, and I was so interested to hear you, especially in light of Katie's question about kind of other words, to hear you reference Emily Wilson's, stroke of genius, translating that as a complicated man. Of course, complicated has such an interesting contemporary resonance too, right? If you say somebody's complicated, that means something, I think, in 2020, much different than it would have meant in 1980. But so somebody says, how about uncomplicated for Einfach, to avoid the implication of simple mind?
The word uncomplicated is too complicated for me. I mean, it's kind of great.
Latin too.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, and I'm trying. There's some book in which that is exactly the right word, but I think for this one, it's too tricky in a point where Thomas Mann is trying to appear guileless and to make Hans Castorp appear guileless, and we will, soon find out how far from true any of that is.
Right. Susan, this has been such a pleasure, both to hear the talk and to have this conversation with you. It was so nice to have it tailored to all of the students in the audience, who I know are greatly appreciative. Of course, we wish that we all could have been in New Haven, but as they say, next year in New Haven.
Next year in New Haven, yeah. It was such an honor to be asked to speak. Thank you so much for the invitation. And thanks for these great questions.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming, and see you elsewhere. Bye-bye.